I woke up at 3:47 a.m. to the sound of someone walking across my kitchen floor. The footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, the kind you make when you're familiar with a place, when you know exactly where the creaky boards are and how to avoid them. Except whoever was down there wasn't avoiding them. Each step landed with a soft thud that seemed to vibrate up through the old farmhouse's bones and into my chest. I lay perfectly still in the darkness of my bedroom, barely breathing, listening to the rhythm of those footsteps as they moved from the kitchen toward the living room. The floorboards groaned under what sounded like considerable weight. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was afraid the intruder might hear it. The walking stopped. In that sudden silence, I became acutely aware of every sound the old house made. The settling of timbers, the whisper of wind through gaps in the siding, the distant hum of the refrigerator. But underneath it all, I could swear I heard something else. Breathing. Slow, measured breathing that definitely wasn't mine. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the emergency call button. The screen's blue glow seemed blindingly bright in the pitch-black room. No signal. Of course there was no signal. Out here in the middle of nowhere, 20 miles from the nearest town, cell service was about as reliable as the weather forecast. The breathing stopped. Then, clear as day, I heard the distinctive creak of my front door opening. Not the violent sound of someone breaking in, but the gentle groan of old hinges that needed oil. The same sound I heard every time I came home from work. Someone had just walked out of my house using my front door, as casually as if they lived here. I waited another 10 minutes before I worked up the courage to go downstairs. Every step felt like I was walking toward my own execution. The house felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. When I flicked on the kitchen light, everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Clean dishes in the drying rack, coffee maker ready for morning, nothing out of place, except for the muddy footprints that led from the back door to the front. The prints were large, maybe size 12, and they tracked across my kitchen floor in a perfectly straight line. No deviation, no hesitation, just a direct path from one door to the other, like someone had walked through my house as a shortcut. The mud was still damp, and when I knelt down to examine it closer, I caught a smell that made my stomach clench. It wasn't just earth and water. There was something else mixed in, something organic and wrong that I couldn't quite identify, but that triggered every evolutionary alarm bell in my brain. Both doors were locked. Both doors were exactly as I'd left them when I went to bed. That was my first night in the house on Millfield Road, the place I'd bought sight unseen from an estate sale, thinking I'd gotten the deal of a lifetime. A 3-bedroom farmhouse on 40 acres, built in 1892 for less than what most people pay for a decent used car. The photos had shown a sturdy structure with good bones, surrounded by rolling hills and mature oak trees. What they hadn't shown was how the silence here had weight to it, how it pressed down on you until you found yourself talking to yourself just to break it up. I'd moved out from Chicago 6 months earlier, burned out from 15 years of corporate consulting, and tired of pretending that helping companies squeeze more profit from their employees was somehow meaningful work. The plan was simple: work remotely for a few clients, write the novel I'd been putting off for a decade, and maybe figure out who I was when I wasn't stuck in traffic or sitting in conference rooms discussing quarterly metrics. The isolation had been the selling point. Now, crouched on my kitchen floor at 4 in the morning, staring at muddy footprints that shouldn't exist, I was beginning to think isolation might not be all it was cracked up to be. I spent the rest of that night sitting at my kitchen table with a baseball bat across my knees, watching both doors and jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke and the first gray light filtered through my windows, the whole thing seemed almost absurd. Footprints could be explained. Maybe I'd tracked mud in myself and forgotten. Maybe the sounds had been the house settling, my imagination filling in the gaps with phantom intruders. But when I went to clean up the prints, they were gone. The floor was spotless, as if it had been mopped while I sat there watching. That should have been my first clue that this wasn't going to be about burglars or practical jokes. But I was still thinking like a rational person then, still trying to fit impossible things into logical explanations. I'd learn better soon enough. The second incident happened 3 days later, on a Thursday morning when the October air carried the first real bite of winter. I was in my office, the converted bedroom upstairs that looked out over the back pasture, when I heard my front door slam shut. Not just close, but slam with the force of someone either furious or in a great hurry. I jogged downstairs expecting to find that the wind had caught the door, but it was locked tight and the day was perfectly still. No breeze stirred the curtains, no leaves rustled outside the windows. Through the front door's glass panels, I could see my gravel driveway stretching empty toward the road. That's when I noticed my car keys were missing. They'd been hanging on the hook beside the door where I always left them, but now the hook was empty. I searched the house from top to bottom, checking every drawer, every pocket, every surface where I might have absent-mindedly set them down. Nothing. It was like they'd simply vanished into thin air. I was standing in my living room, hands on my hips, trying to figure out my next move, when I heard an engine start outside. My engine. The distinctive rumble of my 10-year-old Honda Civic, with its slightly rough idle and the exhaust rattle I'd been meaning to fix for months. I ran to the window and watched my own car back out of the driveway. I could see a figure behind the wheel, but the morning shadows in the car's tinted windows made it impossible to make out any details. The car paused at the end of my driveway, turned signal blinking, then pulled onto Millfield Road and disappeared around the bend toward town. For a long moment I just stood there, brain completely locked up. Someone had broken into my house without leaving a trace, stolen my keys without my knowledge, and driven off in my car in broad daylight. The logical thing to do was call the police, except I still didn't have cell service, and my landline had been disconnected years ago by the previous owner. I walked the 2 miles to my nearest neighbor, a dairy farm run by a woman named Margaret Henley, who'd lived in the valley her whole life. She was in her 70s, with steel gray hair and hands that looked like they could wrestle a bull to the ground. I'd met her once when I'd first moved in, and she'd struck me as the no-nonsense type who wouldn't have patience for tall tales or city folk paranoia. "Car trouble?" she asked when she saw me trudging up her driveway. I explained what had happened, trying to keep my voice level and matter-of-fact. She listened without interruption, her weathered face giving nothing away. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying me with pale blue eyes that seemed to be weighing something. "You're living in the old Carmichael place," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Bought it from the estate sale back in May." She nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Come on inside. We'll call Sheriff Morrison. Get your car situation sorted out." Her kitchen was warm and smelled like fresh bread, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders as she busied herself making coffee and dialing the phone. While she talked to the sheriff, I stared out her window at the rolling hills and tried to convince myself that there was a reasonable explanation for everything that had happened. "Bill's going to keep an eye out for your Honda," Margaret said after she hung up. "Should turn up somewhere around town, probably with an empty gas tank. Kids most likely. They get bored out here, start thinking other people's property is fair game. How would kids get into my house without breaking anything?" My doors were locked, windows too. Margaret refilled my coffee cup, taking her time with the task. "Old houses have their ways," she said carefully, "particularly that one. It's been empty for, must be going on 5 years now. Sometimes empty places attract the wrong kind of attention." There was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't talking about teenage vandals. But before I could ask what she meant, we heard a car engine outside. Through the window I could see my Honda pulling into Margaret's driveway. I went outside to meet it, Margaret following behind me. The car rolled to a stop and the engine shut off, but nobody got out. I approached slowly, half expecting someone to suddenly gun it and take off again, but the car just sat there empty and silent. The driver's door was unlocked. My keys were in the ignition, along with a receipt from Murphy's gas station in town showing a full tank. The odometer showed I'd driven exactly 47 miles, just enough for a round trip to town and back, with maybe a little driving around thrown in. "Told you," Margaret said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Probably some kid with a guilty conscience decided to fill up your tank as an apology." I wanted to believe that. It was certainly better than any of the alternatives my mind was suggesting, but as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from the rearview mirror. Every time I glanced back, though, the road behind me was empty. That night I did something that felt both paranoid and necessary. I moved my desk chair into the hallway between my bedroom and the stairs, and I sat in it until dawn with the baseball bat across my knees. If someone was coming into my house, I was going to be ready for them. Nothing happened. I dozed fitfully in the chair, jerking awake every time the house creaked or the wind rattled a window. But no mysterious footsteps echoed from downstairs, no doors slammed shut. By morning I was stiff, exhausted, and starting to wonder if the isolation was getting to me more than I'd realized. Over the next week I tried to settle back into some kind of routine. I worked on a proposal for a new client, a manufacturing company in Ohio that wanted help streamlining their supply chain. I took long walks around the property, exploring the overgrown pastures and the old barn that leaned at a precarious angle about 100 yards from the house. I drove to town twice, once for groceries, and once just to be around other people for a few hours. Town was a place called Millfield, population 847, according to the sign on the way in, though I suspected that number was optimistic. It had a main street with a handful of businesses, Murphy's gas station, a diner called the Crossroads, a general store that seemed to sell everything from fishing tackle to prescription drugs, and a post office that doubled as the town hall. Everyone I met was polite but reserved, the kind of politeness that small-town people show to outsiders who might or might not stick around. At the Crossroads, I struck up a conversation with the waitress, a woman about my age named Linda, who had the tired look of someone working 2 jobs to make ends meet. When I mentioned where I was living, her expression shifted slightly. "The old Carmichael house," she said, refilling my coffee cup. "Haven't seen anyone out that way in years. What happened to the previous owners?" Linda glanced around the nearly empty diner, then leaned closer. "Tom Carmichael inherited it from his father back in the 90s. Lived there with his wife and their 2 kids. Everything was fine for a few years, then," she shrugged, "Tom started having problems. Drinking too much, staying up all night. His wife Sarah said he claimed someone was living in their house with them, someone they couldn't see. Mental illness? That's what everyone figured. But Sarah started hearing things too. Footsteps, voices, doors opening and closing. She took the kids and moved in with her sister in Portland. Tom stayed behind, said he wasn't going to be driven out of his own home. What happened to him? Found dead at the bottom of his basement stairs one morning. Broke his neck in the fall. Sheriff Morrison ruled it an accident. Said Tom had been drinking and probably just lost his footing, but..." She straightened up as another customer entered the diner. Well, some folks had their doubts. I wanted to ask more questions, but Linda had already moved on to greet the new arrival. I finished my coffee and left, but her words followed me home like a shadow. That night I found myself standing in front of my basement door for the first time since I'd moved in. The previous owners had left the basement mostly empty, except for the furnace, some old paint cans, and a few pieces of broken furniture that weren't worth moving. I'd been down there exactly once, just long enough to check that the furnace was working and the foundation looked solid. I opened the door and flicked on the light. The wooden stairs descended into a rectangle of harsh fluorescent illumination that somehow made the basement look more ominous rather than less. The air smelled of mildew and something else, that same organic wrongness I'd detected in the muddy footprints that first night. I forced myself to walk down the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was larger than I remembered, extending back under the entire house. Concrete walls sweated with moisture, and in the far corner, I could see what looked like an old coal chute sealed up with bricks and mortar. Everything was exactly as I remembered it, but something felt different. The air seemed thicker somehow, almost viscous, and I had the distinct impression that I wasn't alone down there. I turned slowly, scanning every corner, every shadow, but saw nothing except old furniture and household detritus. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were fainter than the ones in my kitchen that first night, but they were definitely there, a trail of dusty impressions that led from the bottom of the stairs to the sealed coal chute and back again. The prints looked fresh, and when I knelt down to examine them, I could see the distinctive tread pattern of work boots. I followed the trail to the coal chute. Up close, I could see that the mortar around the bricks looked newer than the rest of the wall, probably patched within the last few decades. Someone had taken care to seal this opening thoroughly, using more mortar than strictly necessary. A sound from upstairs made me freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crossing the kitchen floor directly above my head. I grabbed an old hammer from a workbench and crept back toward the stairs. The footsteps continued, moving from the kitchen into the living room, then stopping. I climbed the stairs as quietly as possible, holding the hammer like a weapon, my heart hammering so loud I was sure whoever was up there could hear it. The basement door was closed. I knew I'd left it open. I always left doors open when I was just stepping into another room for a moment, but now it was closed, and when I tried the handle, it was locked. From the outside, I pounded on the door and shouted, but there was no response. The footsteps had stopped, and the house above me was silent as a tomb. I tried throwing my shoulder against the door, but it was solid wood and barely budged. It took me 20 minutes to find an old screwdriver and work the hinges off the door. When I finally got it open, the house was empty and dark. Every light I'd left on was off, including the basement light, which had somehow been switched off while I was down there. My front door was standing wide open, letting in the cold October night. I walked through the house, turning on every light, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. No muddy footprints, no disturbed furniture, just my own paranoid imagination and a house that felt like it was watching me. I spent that night in my car in the driveway, engine running, heater on, doors locked. Every few minutes I'd check my rearview mirror, expecting to see a face pressed against my bedroom window or a figure standing in my doorway, but the house just sat there, dark and silent and patient. When morning came, I seriously considered packing up my things and heading back to Chicago. I'd already paid cash for the house, so walking away wouldn't be a financial disaster, just an expensive lesson in the importance of thorough property inspections. But something stubborn in me rebelled against the idea of being driven off by what might just be an overactive imagination and a few unexplained noises. Instead, I drove back to town and bought the biggest, loudest dog I could find. The animal shelter in the next county over had a German Shepherd mix named Rex, who'd been returned twice for being too protective of his previous families. He was 3 years old, 85 pounds of muscle and suspicion, and he took an immediate dislike to everyone except me. Perfect. Rex rode home in the passenger seat of my Honda, alert and watchful, his ears swiveling at every sound. When we pulled into the driveway, he started growling low in his throat, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I asked. But Rex just kept staring at the house, every muscle in his body tense. He wouldn't go inside at first. I had to practically drag him through the front door, and once we were in, he stayed pressed against my leg like he was afraid to venture more than a few feet away from me. When I tried to take him down to the basement, he planted his feet and refused to budge. That night, Rex slept on the floor beside my bed, but he barely slept at all. Every few hours he'd get up and pace the room, whining softly and staring at the door. Twice he barked at something I couldn't see or hear, sharp warning barks that made my blood pressure spike. Around 2 a.m., he started growling at the corner of my bedroom where the old radiator sat beneath the window. I followed his gaze, but saw nothing except shadows. The growling went on for several minutes, getting deeper and more threatening, until finally Rex launched himself at the empty corner with a snarl. He hit the wall hard enough to rattle the window and fell back, dazed but still snapping at whatever he thought was there. I turned on every light in the room, but there was nothing to see, just Rex, hackles raised, backing toward me while keeping his eyes fixed on that corner. We spent the rest of the night downstairs in the living room with all the lights on and the television providing some comforting background noise. Rex gradually calmed down, but he never fully relaxed. He kept one eye on the stairs as if expecting something to come down them. The next morning, I called Margaret Henley. "I need to ask you about the history of my house," I said without preamble when she answered. "The real history, not just what's in the real estate listing." There was a long pause. "Tom Carmichael's death wasn't the beginning of it," she said finally. "That house has had problems for as long as I can remember, and I've been in this valley for 73 years. What kind of problems? The kind people don't like to talk about. The kind that make good Christian folks cross themselves and change the subject." Another pause. "You should come over for lunch. Some things are better discussed face to face." An hour later, I was sitting at Margaret's kitchen table again, this time with Rex lying at my feet. The dog had been reluctant to leave the car, but seemed more relaxed once we were inside Margaret's house. "Smart animal," Margaret said, offering Rex a piece of her sandwich. "Dogs know things we've forgotten how to notice." She poured herself a cup of tea and settled back in her chair, studying me with those sharp blue eyes. "What do you know about the land your house sits on?" "Just what was in the deed. 40 acres, purchased by the original owner in 1891, house built the following year. The original owner was a man named Ezra Millfield, town's named after him. He came out from Pennsylvania with big plans to start a farming community, bring in families, build schools and churches. Good intentions by all accounts. But the land had a history before Ezra got here. The local tribes avoided that particular valley, called it a thin place where the world of the living and the world of the dead got a little too close for comfort. Ezra didn't put much stock in native superstitions, figured it was just primitive nonsense. Margaret stirred her tea thoughtfully. Ezra built his house right on top of an old burial ground. Not intentionally. He probably never even knew it was there. But when you disturb the dead, sometimes they don't stay disturbed quietly. You're talking about ghosts. I'm talking about something that was already wrong with that place before your house was ever built. Something that gets stronger every time tragedy strikes there." She met my eyes. "And there's been plenty of tragedy over the years." She told me about the Millfield family. Ezra's wife had died in childbirth in that house, and their infant son had died 3 days later. Ezra himself had lasted another 5 years before he was found dead in his basement, apparently having fallen down the stairs. The next family to live there, the Weatherbys, had lost 2 children to fever in the winter of 1903. Samuel Weatherby had hung himself in the barn the following spring. The house sat empty for almost a decade after that. Margaret continued. "Then the Kesslers bought it in 1914. They managed to stick it out for 6 years before their youngest daughter disappeared one night. Never found so much as a trace of her. The pattern went on. Family after family moving in with hopes and dreams, only to be driven out by tragedy or terror or both. Some left quickly, others tried to tough it out, but the outcome was always the same: death, madness, or disappearance. What about the coal chute? I asked. Someone bricked it up. Margaret's expression darkened. That would have been Tom Carmichael. After his wife and kids left, he became obsessed with the idea that something was getting into his house through that old chute. Spent weeks down in that basement with bags of mortar, sealing it up tight. Didn't help, of course. Whatever's in that house doesn't need doors. So what am I supposed to do? Just pack up and leave? Most people would. Most people should. She studied Rex, who had fallen asleep at my feet. But you're not most people, are you? You've got that stubborn look my late husband used to get when he'd made up his mind about something. I've run away from things before. I'm tired of running. Margaret nodded like she'd expected as much. Then you're going to need to understand what you're up against. And you're going to need help. She stood up and walked to an old china cabinet in the corner of her kitchen. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a manila folder thick with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. I've been keeping track, she said, setting the folder on the table between us. Every strange death, every family that left in the middle of the night, every unexplained incident in that valley for the past 70 years. If you're determined to stay in that house, you need to know what happened to the others. I opened the folder and immediately wished I hadn't. The first thing I saw was a photograph of Tom Carmichael's body at the bottom of his basement stairs, his neck bent at an impossible angle. The second was a missing person report for 8-year-old Jenny Kessler, dated 1920. The thing about thin places, Margaret said softly, is that they work both ways. The dead can reach through to our world, but the living can also slip through to theirs, sometimes permanently. I spent the rest of the afternoon going through Margaret's files. The documentation was meticulous. Police reports, coroner statements, interviews with survivors. A pattern emerged that was both fascinating and terrifying. The phenomena always started small. Footsteps, cold spots, objects moving on their own, but it escalated quickly, as if whatever was in the house fed on fear and attention. Families who tried to ignore it or explain it away lasted longer than those who acknowledged it, but the outcome was always the same. What's different about me? I asked. Why am I still alive when so many others are dead? Maybe because you're alone, Margaret said. Most of the worst incidents involved families, especially families with children. Whatever's in that house seems to be drawn to innocence, to hope, to love. Maybe it can't get as strong a hold on someone who's already given up on those things. Her words stung more than I cared to admit. Thanks for the pep talk. I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. I'm trying to keep you alive. She collected the files and slid them back into the folder. If you're going to stay, there are rules. Don't go into the basement alone, especially not at night. Don't acknowledge whatever you see or hear. Acknowledgement feeds it. And whatever you do, don't try to communicate with it. That's how you go from being haunted to being possessed. Rex stirred at my feet, lifting his head to look toward Margaret's front window. Outside, the afternoon shadows were growing longer, and I realized I'd been there for nearly 4 hours. I should head home before dark, I said, standing up. Take this. Margaret handed me a small cloth bag that smelled of herbs and something sharper, more medicinal. My grandmother's recipe. Hang it above your front door. You think a bag of herbs is going to protect me from whatever killed all those people? I think you're going to need every advantage you can get. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rex sat alert in the passenger seat, occasionally whining as we got closer to the house. When we pulled into the driveway, he started that low growling again. The house looked different in the late afternoon light. Smaller somehow, more crooked, as if it were slowly collapsing in on itself. Several of the upstairs windows reflected the dying sun like watching eyes, and I found myself checking the rearview mirror to make sure no one was standing behind my car. Rex refused to get out of the Honda. I had to carry all 85 pounds of him to the front door, where he immediately started struggling to get back to the car. It took both arms and all my strength to wrestle him inside, and once we were in, he pressed himself against the door like he was ready to bolt at the first opportunity. I hung Margaret's herb bag above the door, feeling ridiculous but also oddly comforted by the ritual. Then I fed Rex and tried to settle in for what I knew would be another sleepless night. The footsteps started around midnight. They were different this time, lighter, more hesitant, like someone exploring unfamiliar territory. Rex heard them too and started pacing the living room, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors. But when I listened more carefully, I realized there were 2 sets of footsteps. One was Rex's familiar gait. The other was something else entirely. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sounds toward the kitchen. Rex stayed close to my side, trembling but determined. The footsteps seemed to be coming from directly above us in my bedroom. Slow, deliberate steps that traced a path from my bed to the window and back again. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. Margaret had specifically warned me not to acknowledge whatever was in the house, but the words slipped out before I could stop myself, driven by a desperate need to break the tension. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the house was perfectly silent. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. My own voice, calling down from upstairs. Hello, the same word, the same inflection, but hollow somehow, like an echo of an echo. Rex started barking frantically, backing toward the front door with his hackles raised. Hello, came the voice again. Closer now, as if whatever was imitating me had moved to the top of the stairs. I grabbed Rex's collar and pulled him toward the door, not caring about the bitter cold outside or the fact that I was wearing nothing but pajamas and slippers. We stumbled out into the night, Rex immediately calming down once we were clear of the house. From the safety of my driveway, I looked back at the bedroom window. For just a moment I could swear I saw a figure silhouetted against the glass, tall, broad-shouldered, looking down at me with what might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. Then the figure stepped back into the shadows, and the window was empty. I sat in my car with Rex until dawn, engine running, heater on high, watching the house for any sign of movement. Several times I thought I saw lights flickering in windows that should have been dark, and once I could have sworn someone was watching me from the kitchen window. But whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there. As the sun came up, painting the sky pale pink and gold, the house looked normal again. Just an old farmhouse that needed a coat of paint and some new shutters. The kind of place where a person might live quietly and contentedly for decades, raising children and growing old in peaceful isolation. I almost believed it. Rex was willing to go back inside once the sun was fully up, though he remained nervous and clingy. I made coffee and tried to think rationally about my situation. I'd been living in the house for 3 weeks, and the incidents were getting worse. More frequent, more intense, more personal. Whatever was sharing my home with me seemed to be growing stronger. The smart thing to do was leave, pack up my things, put the house back on the market, and find somewhere else to start over. Anywhere else. But every time I considered it, something stubborn in me rebelled against the idea. I'd spent too much of my life running away from difficult situations, bad jobs, failed relationships, my own disappointments and fears. This felt like the last line I could draw in the sand. Besides, where would I go? Back to Chicago, to the life I'd already decided I couldn't stand, to some other small town where I'd have to explain why I'd walked away from a beautiful house on 40 acres because I was afraid of things that went bump in the night. No, I was going to stay. I was going to figure this out. I spent the morning researching everything I could find about the house online, property records, historical documents, old newspaper archives. Most of it confirmed what Margaret had already told me, but I found a few interesting details she'd missed. The original burial ground had been discovered in 1923 when the Kessler family tried to dig a well. They'd uncovered human remains and what appeared to be ritual artifacts, pottery, carved stones, items that suggested the site had been sacred to the local tribes for centuries. The Kesslers had quietly reburied everything and moved their well to a different location, but not before local archaeologists had taken extensive notes and photographs. More interesting was a report from 1943 about strange lights seen over the valley. Multiple witnesses had described glowing orbs that moved with apparent intelligence, sometimes approaching houses before suddenly disappearing. The army had investigated, thinking it might be related to enemy aircraft, but they'd found no evidence of foreign activity. The lights had been seen regularly until 1951, when they'd apparently stopped for no apparent reason. 1951 was also the year the house had been empty. The previous owners, the Hendersons, had left suddenly after their teenage son had been found dead in his bedroom, with no apparent cause of death. I was deep in a 1960s police report about the disappearance of an entire family when Rex started barking again. Not the frantic barking of the previous night, but sharp alert barks that meant he'd seen or heard something specific. I looked out the kitchen window and saw a pickup truck pulling into my driveway. It was an older model Ford, rust-red paint faded by decades of sun and weather. The man who got out was tall and rangy, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of deep tan that came from working outdoors. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose back had been giving him trouble for years. Rex stopped barking but remained alert as the man approached my front door. When he knocked, it was a polite, unhurried sound, the knock of someone who had legitimate business and all the time in the world. "Help you?" I asked through the door. "Name's Bill Morrison. I'm the sheriff around here. Thought I'd stop by and see how you're settling in." I recognized the name from Margaret's files. Sheriff Morrison had investigated several of the deaths and disappearances over the years. I opened the door, keeping Rex close beside me. Morrison was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 50s, with intelligent brown eyes and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. He looked like the kind of lawman who preferred talking problems through to shooting his way out of them. "Nice dog," he said, offering Rex his hand to sniff. Rex considered the gesture for a moment, then allowed allowed Morrison to scratch behind his ears. German Shepherd mix, something like that. Coffee? Don't mind if I do. We settled at my kitchen table, Rex lying at my feet, but keeping his eyes on Morrison. The sheriff looked around the kitchen with the practiced gaze of someone who noticed details for a living. "How long have you been living out here?" he asked. "About 3 weeks. And how are you finding it?" Must be quite a change from city life. I wondered how he knew I was from the city, but then realized that in a town of 800 people, everyone probably knew everyone else's business. "It's definitely quieter than I'm used to." Morrison nodded, sipping his coffee. "Isolation can take some getting used to, especially in an old house like this one. Old houses make a lot of noise, settling, creaking, pipes expanding and contracting. Sometimes city folks aren't used to all that." There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't just small talk. "Has someone complained about noise?" "Nothing like that. It's just that this house has a reputation. Margaret Henley called me yesterday, said she was worried about you, thought maybe you were having some adjustment issues." I felt a flash of annoyance. I'd told Margaret about the incidents in confidence, not expecting her to call in the cavalry. "I'm fine, Sheriff. Just getting used to country living." Morrison studied me for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Mind if I speak plainly?" "Go ahead." "I've been sheriff of this county for 12 years. In that time, I've had to investigate 3 deaths in this house, 2 missing person cases, and more domestic disturbance calls than I care to count. Every single family that's lived here has reported the same things: strange noises, cold spots, objects moving on their own. Some folks handle it better than others." He paused to take another sip of coffee. "Now, I'm not saying I believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense, but I am saying that something about this place affects people. Maybe it's the isolation. Maybe it's something in the water. Maybe it's just the power of suggestion. But whatever it is, it's real enough to have killed Tom Carmichael and God knows how many others." "What are you suggesting I do?" "I'm suggesting you take Margaret's concerns seriously. She's lived in this valley longer than anyone, and she's seen what this place can do to people. If she's worried about you, there's probably a good reason." Rex suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward. He was staring at the basement door, which I was absolutely certain I'd left closed. Now it was standing slightly ajar, just wide enough for someone to slip through. Morrison followed my gaze and frowned. "Basement door sticking?" "Something like that." He stood up and walked over to examine the door. "Old houses settle funny sometimes. Frames get warped, doors don't hang quite right." He pushed the door closed, then opened it again. It swung freely on well-oiled hinges. "Seems fine to me." But as soon as he turned away, the door started to drift open again, slowly, silently, as if someone on the other side was pulling it. Morrison saw it too. He turned back to the door, his casual demeanor replaced by something more alert and professional. "That's unusual." Rex was on his feet now, growling low in his throat. The sound seemed to fill the kitchen, vibrating through the floorboards and up into my chest. "Sheriff," I said carefully, "what if it's not suggestion? What if there really is something wrong with this house?" Morrison closed the door again, this time engaging the old-fashioned latch. "Then you need to decide if you're willing to live with it or if you're smart enough to leave." The door stayed closed this time, but I could feel something pressing against it from the other side. Not physically. There was no vibration, no sound of impact, but the sensation was unmistakable. Something wanted out of that basement, and it was getting stronger. "Tell me about Tom Carmichael," I said. Morrison sat back down, but he kept one eye on the basement door. "Tom was a good man, steady job, loving family, no history of mental illness or substance abuse. Then he started claiming someone was living in his house with them. Said he could hear them walking around at night, moving things, using the bathroom. His wife thought he was having a breakdown. But you didn't." I responded to 3 calls from that address in the 6 months before Tom died. Each time, I found signs that someone had been in the house, muddy footprints, food missing from the refrigerator, that sort of thing. But there was never any evidence of forced entry, and Tom swore he'd changed the locks twice. Morrison paused, choosing his words carefully. "The night Tom died, Sarah called me around midnight. Said she could hear someone walking around upstairs, but Tom was passed out drunk on the couch, and the kids were in bed. I got here 15 minutes later and found Tom at the bottom of the basement stairs. You think someone pushed him? I think Tom went down those stairs to investigate a noise, and whatever he found there scared him enough to make him lose his footing." Morrison met my eyes. "The basement door was locked from the inside when I found him. No other way in or out." A chill ran down my spine. "Locked from the inside?" "That's right. I had to break the door down to get to him. There was no one else down there, no other exit, no way anyone could have gotten out. But Tom had bruises on his arms consistent with being grabbed or shaken, and his expression." Morrison shook his head. "I've seen a lot of dead bodies in my time. Most people who die from falls look peaceful, like they just went to sleep. Tom looked terrified. Rex was still staring at the basement door, his whole body tense with alertness. As we watched, the latch started to rattle, gently at first, then with increasing intensity. Morrison stood up slowly, his hand drifting toward the service weapon on his belt. That door is latched tight. There's no wind down there, no reason for it to be moving. The rattling stopped abruptly, leaving the kitchen in heavy silence. Then, clear as day, we heard footsteps on the basement stairs, slow, measured steps climbing toward us. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door handle started to turn. Morrison drew his weapon, a move that seemed both completely rational and utterly absurd under the circumstances. "Police, identify yourself." The door handle stopped moving. Then, from the other side of the door, came the sound of breathing. Slow, deep breaths that seemed to go on far longer than any human lungs should be able to sustain. Rex was backing toward the front door now, whining low in his throat. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The breathing stopped. Then, in a voice that sounded exactly like mine but wrong somehow, came a single word: "Help." Morrison looked at me, his face pale. "That wasn't you?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice. "Help," came the voice again, more urgently this time. "Please help me." Morrison holstered his weapon and pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Morrison at 47 Millfield Road. I need backup in an ambulance. Possible intruder trapped in a basement." The radio crackled with static, then went dead. Morrison tried again, but got nothing but white noise. "Help me," the voice called again, and this time there was something desperate about it, something that tugged at every human instinct to aid someone in distress. "I'm hurt. Please." Morrison reached for the door latch, then stopped. What if it's a trap? What if it's not? But even as I said it, I knew we shouldn't open that door. Whatever was behind it wasn't human, wasn't hurt, wasn't in need of help. It was something else entirely, something that had learned to mimic human speech to lure us closer. The voice changed then, becoming Tom Carmichael's voice, though I'd never heard the man speak in life. "Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't go down there." Then it was a child's voice, high and frightened. "Daddy, Daddy, where are you?" Then an old woman, "Help me find my way home." Then my own voice again. "I'm scared. I don't want to be alone anymore." Morrison backed away from the door, his face grim. "We're leaving, now." We made it to the front door before the basement door exploded open behind us. Not just swung open, exploded, as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to it from the inside. Splinters of wood flew across the kitchen, and a blast of freezing air rolled up from the basement like a physical thing. Rex bolted for the car, and Morrison and I weren't far behind. We piled into Morrison's pickup truck, and he gunned the engine without bothering to let it warm up. Gravel sprayed as we tore out of the driveway and onto Millfield Road. In the rearview mirror, I could see my house receding into the distance. For just a moment, I thought I saw figures standing in the windows, tall, dark shapes that moved with fluid grace. Then we rounded a bend, and the house disappeared behind the trees. "What the hell was that?" Morrison asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know." "Bullshit. You've been living there for 3 weeks. You had to have seen something before today." I told him everything. The footsteps, the muddy prints, the missing car keys, the voice that had mimicked mine. Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "Why didn't you call me sooner? Would you have believed me?" Morrison was quiet for a moment. "No, probably not. But I believe you now." We drove to Margaret's farm, where Morrison used her landline to call for backup. Within an hour, 3 state police cruisers had arrived, along with a K-9 unit and what looked like a SWAT team. I watched from Margaret's kitchen window as they surrounded my house and prepared to search it from top to bottom. "They won't find anything," Margaret said, setting a cup of tea in front of me. "Whatever's in there doesn't show itself to skeptics, but it showed itself to Morrison. Sheriff Morrison isn't a skeptic. He's seen too much in this valley to dismiss things out of hand." She sat down across from me, her weathered hands wrapped around her own cup. "The question is, what are you going to do now?" "I don't know. I can't go back there. Not after what happened. But I can't just abandon everything I own. Your possessions aren't worth your life." Through the window I could see the police officers emerging from my house. Even from a distance, they looked shaken. One of them was talking rapidly into his radio, while another officer examined something in his hands. Morrison's truck pulled into Margaret's driveway a few minutes later. He walked into the kitchen with the expression of a man who'd seen something that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. "Well?" Margaret asked. "We found the basement door blown to pieces, just like you said. And we found something else." He held up an evidence bag containing what looked like a fragment of of old bone. This was embedded in one of the door pieces. The medical examiner will have to confirm it, but it looks human. Could be from the old burial ground, Margaret said. The whole area is probably full of remains. Maybe, but this was fresh, like it had been broken off something recently. Morrison sat down heavily at the table. There's more. My officers found footprints in the basement, dozens of them, all different sizes, all leading to that sealed coal chute. And the temperature down there, he shook his head. It was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the house. I thought about the voice that had mimicked mine, then changed to other voices. Tom Carmichael, a child, an old woman. How many people have died in that house over the years? Too many, Margaret said quietly. And if the stories are true, they're all still there. The police cordoned off my house as a crime scene, though I suspect they had no idea what crime they were investigating. Morrison advised me to find somewhere else to stay while they completed their investigation, which could take days or weeks. What about my things? We'll escort you in to get what you absolutely need, but I wouldn't recommend staying there tonight. I ended up in a motel room in the next town over. Rex curled up on the floor beside my bed. The room was generic and anonymous, beige walls, polyester bedspread, the lingering smell of industrial disinfectant. After 3 weeks in a house with character and history, it felt like hiding in a sterile box, but it was safe. Whatever had been in my house couldn't follow me here, couldn't reach through thin places to breathe on my neck or speak with my voice. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking to mysterious footsteps or slamming doors. The next morning, Morrison called to tell me that the state police had finished their initial investigation. They'd found no evidence of intruders, no signs of forced entry, no logical explanation for the destroyed door or the bone fragments. The case was being classified as unexplained phenomena and quietly filed away. Unexplained phenomena, it's a catch-all category for things that don't fit into normal investigative parameters. UFO sightings, Bigfoot encounters, houses that blow their own doors off from the inside. The state boys don't like admitting they can't explain something, but they're not stupid enough to ignore evidence either. So I can go back. Legally, yes. The house is yours, and there's no ongoing criminal investigation. But I strongly advise against it. I spent the day driving around the county, trying to clear my head and figure out my next move. The autumn colors were spectacular, rolling hills covered in red and gold, farmhouses nestled in valleys like scenes from a postcard. It was beautiful country, peaceful and timeless, the kind of place where a person could disappear from the world's concerns and live quietly for decades. But everywhere I went, I found myself thinking about the house. Not with longing. God knows I had no desire to spend another night listening to phantom footsteps, but with a nagging sense of unfinished business. Whatever was in that house had been there for over a century, driving out families, causing deaths, feeding on fear and tragedy. How many more people would it claim if I just walked away? That evening I drove back to Margaret's farm. She was in her garden, harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes before the first frost could get them. "Thought you might be back," she said without looking up. "Rex been behaving himself?" "He's fine. Seems happier away from the house." I watched her work for a moment, enjoying the simple normality of it. "Margaret, what would it take to stop this thing?" She straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands. "Stop it. You can't stop something like that. You can only appease it or avoid it. What if you couldn't avoid it? What if you had to find a way to make it stop?" Margaret studied me with those sharp blue eyes. "You're thinking about going back. I'm thinking about ending this. That house has been claiming victims for over 100 years. If I don't do something, it's just going to keep happening. And what makes you think you can succeed where everyone else failed? Maybe because I don't have as much to lose." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, then gestured toward her house. "Come inside. There's something I need to show you." Her living room was cozy and cluttered, filled with the accumulated possessions of a long life. Books, photographs, knickknacks collected from decades of travel and experience. But Margaret led me to a corner where an old roll-top desk sat beneath a window overlooking the valley. "My grandmother lived in this house before me," she said, opening the desk to reveal dozens of small drawers and compartments. "She was what people today might call a folk healer. Back then we just called her wise." From one of the compartments, she pulled out a leather journal bound with a faded ribbon. The pages were yellowed with age and covered in spidery handwriting. "This is her record of the disturbances at your house." She kept track of every incident, every death, every family that fled in the middle of the night. But more importantly, she tried to understand why it was happening. I opened the journal carefully, afraid the old pages might crumble in my hands. The entries went back to the 1920s, written in a precise, educated hand that grew more urgent as the years passed. According to her research, the burial ground your house sits on wasn't just any burial ground, it was a place where the tribe sent their dead who had died violently or under suspicious circumstances. Murder victims, suicides, people who had been cursed or cast out, the dead who couldn't rest easy. A cursed burial ground. How original. Mock it if you want, but my grandmother understood something important. The house isn't haunted by one spirit, it's haunted by dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Every person who died violently on that land, including the original inhabitants and everyone who came after. I flipped through the pages, seeing names and dates, sketches of symbols and diagrams I didn't understand. Did she ever try to do anything about it? She tried blessing the house in 1954, after the Henderson boy died. Used every cleansing ritual she knew, every protective charm our family had passed down for generations. Margaret pointed to a particular entry, written in heavier ink as if the pen had been pressed down with unusual force. It made things worse, much worse. According to the journal, Margaret's grandmother's cleansing ritual had triggered a surge of activity that lasted for months. Windows exploded, furniture moved on its own, and neighbors reported seeing figures walking through the walls of the empty house. 3 people in the valley had suffered heart attacks that winter, all while looking toward the house on Millfield Road. She realized that trying to cleanse the spirits was like poking a hornet's nest with a stick. It just made them angry. So what's the alternative? Margaret turned to the back of the journal, where the handwriting became even more cramped and urgent. She spent the last years of her life researching a different approach. Instead of trying to drive the spirits away, she tried to find out what they wanted. The final entries were fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. Margaret's grandmother had apparently attempted to communicate with the entities in the house, using a combination of native rituals and European folk magic. What she discovered was that the spirits weren't malevolent by nature. They were trapped. The burial ground was meant to be temporary, Margaret explained. A place to hold troubled spirits until proper rituals could be performed to help them pass on. But when Ezra Millfield built his house on top of it, he disrupted those rituals. The spirits have been stuck there ever since, growing more angry and desperate with each passing year, and every person who dies in that house joins them. Exactly. Tom Carmichael, all the children who died of fever, everyone who committed suicide or died violently on that land, they're all part of it now. A growing collection of trapped souls that gets stronger and more dangerous with each new edition. I closed the journal, my mind reeling. What did your grandmother think could be done? She believed the only way to stop it was to complete the original rituals, to help all the trapped spirits pass on to whatever comes next. Margaret took the journal back and returned it to the desk, but she never got the chance to try it. She died of a stroke in 1962, and her secrets died with her. What kind of rituals? The dangerous kind. The kind that require you to go into that house, down into that basement, and confront whatever's down there directly. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the valley. My house was visible in the distance, a dark shape against the hillside that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I have to go back, I said finally. No, you don't. You can walk away, start over somewhere else. Forget this place ever existed, and let it keep killing people. Margaret sighed. You're not responsible for what that house does. Maybe not. But I'm responsible for what I do. I stood up. Decision made. Will you help me? Help you do what? Exactly. Complete the rituals your grandmother researched. Find a way to set those spirits free. Margaret stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head. You're talking about going into that basement, into the very heart of whatever's down there, and performing rituals we don't fully understand to appease entities that have been growing more powerful for over a century. It's suicide, maybe, but it's also the only chance those spirits have of finding peace, and the only chance future residents have of living in that house without dying. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the valley as darkness settled over the hills. Finally, she stood up and walked back to the desk. There's one more thing my grandmother left behind, she said, opening a different compartment. Something she said should only be used as a last resort. From the drawer, she pulled out a small wooden box carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight. Inside, wrapped in black silk, was what looked like a piece of charcoal, except it was perfectly smooth and seemed to absorb light like a tiny black hole. She called it a spirit anchor, said it was made from wood taken from a tree that had been struck by lightning 7 times. If the rituals don't work, if the spirits can't be convinced to pass on peacefully, this can be used to bind them permanently. Bind them how? By anchoring them to a physical object instead of to the land. The anchor would have to be buried somewhere far from the house, somewhere they could rest without being disturbed again. I reached for the box, but Margaret pulled it back. There's a cost. The person who uses the anchor becomes bound to it as well. They have to stay with it, to guard it, for the rest of their life. And when they die, She shrugged. Well, my grandmother wasn't clear about what happens then. So either I succeed in helping the spirits pass on, or I spend the rest of my life as their jailer. That's about the size of it. I thought about it for a moment, weighing my options. I could walk away, leave the house to claim more victims, and live with the knowledge that I'd chosen safety over responsibility. Or I could try to end a cycle of death and suffering that had been going on for over a century, knowing that failure might cost me everything. When I put it like that, the choice was obvious. When do we start? Margaret closed the box and set it on the table between us. We don't start anything. I'm 73 years old, and I've got arthritis and a bad heart. I'm not going into that house. Then I'll go alone. No, you won't. Because if you're determined to do this fool thing, you're going to do it right. And that means you need someone who understands the rituals, someone who can guide you through them. Who? Margaret smiled grimly. My granddaughter, Elena. She's been studying our family's traditions for years, and she's young enough and foolish enough to think she can take on the world. 2 days later, Elena Henley drove up from Portland in a battered Volkswagen van painted with murals of trees and mountains. She was in her late 20s with her grandmother's sharp blue eyes and an aura of competent confidence that reminded me of a younger Margaret. Her dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and her hands were stained with what looked like paint or dye. So you're the one who wants to go poking around in a house full of angry ghosts, she said by way of introduction. Something like that. And you think you can succeed where everyone else has failed because I don't have anywhere else to go. Elena studied me for a moment, then nodded approvingly. Good answer. People with nothing to lose are dangerous, and dangerous people are exactly what we need for something like this. She'd brought boxes of supplies, candles, herbs, crystals, things I didn't recognize, and books that looked older than Margaret's journal. Over dinner, she explained what we were going to attempt. The original rituals were designed to guide spirits from the temporary burial ground to their final resting place. Think of it as a spiritual highway system. The burial ground was supposed to be a rest stop, not a destination, and building the house on top of it was like constructing a roadblock. Exactly. The spirits have been stuck at that rest stop for over a century, and they're not happy about it. Elena spread a hand-drawn map on the table, showing the layout of my house and the surrounding property. According to grandmother's research, there are 3 anchor points where the spiritual energy is strongest. The basement obviously, but also the old well that the Kesslers dug, and the barn. What do we do at each anchor point? Create a pathway, a spiritual doorway that allows the trapped spirits to continue their journey. But, she hesitated, there's something else. Something grandmother's journal only hints at. What? The spirits aren't just trapped, they're guarded. There's something else down there, something that's been feeding on their energy for over a century. It's not human, never was human, and it doesn't want to give up its food source. Margaret, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. A guardian entity. My grandmother called it the warden. What kind of entity? Elena shrugged. Something old, something that was attracted to the spiritual disturbance when the first settlers died on that land. It's been growing stronger ever since, feeding on the fear and pain of the trapped spirits and everyone who dies in that house. So we're not just dealing with ghosts, we're dealing with something that's been keeping them prisoner. Right. And it's not going to give them up without a fight. We spent the next day preparing. Elena taught me the basics of the rituals we'd be performing. Simple chants and movements that were supposed to open doorways between the world of the living and the world of the dead. She also showed me how to create protective circles and how to recognize signs that the spirits were becoming aggressive. The most important thing to remember, she said, is that we're not trying to banish or destroy anything. We're trying to help. The spirits want to move on. They're just trapped and confused. If we approach this with compassion and respect, they should cooperate. And if they don't, Elena glanced at the wooden box containing the spirit anchor. Then we hope that thing works as advertised. That evening we drove to my house. Rex came with us, though he whined and trembled the entire way. Elena had insisted on bringing him, saying that dogs were natural psychic barometers and would warn us if things got too dangerous. The house looked different than I remembered. Smaller, more crooked, as if it were slowly sinking into the earth. Several windows were dark, but others flickered with pale light that moved like candle flames. Is the electricity on? Elena asked. I never turned it off. But I don't think those are electric lights. Elena nodded grimly. They know we're here. We started with the well. It was located about 50 yards behind the house, covered with rotting boards and surrounded by overgrown weeds. Elena had me hold a flashlight while she cleared away the debris and set up her ritual materials. Candles arranged in a specific pattern, small bowls of herbs and water, crystals placed at cardinal points around the well opening. This is where it all started, she said, lighting the candles one by one. When the Kesslers disturbed the burial ground, they opened a wound in the spiritual fabric of this place. We're going to try to heal that wound. The ritual ritual was surprisingly simple. Elena chanted in a language I didn't recognize while walking slowly around the well. I was supposed to focus on the idea of doorways opening, of paths leading from darkness into light. It felt a little silly at first, like I was participating in an elaborate game of make-believe. Then the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of a few seconds. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the grass around our feet. Rex started barking frantically, backing away from the well with his hackles raised. "Keep focusing," Elena said, her voice tight with concentration. "They're responding." The candles began to flicker, though there was no wind. In their wavering light, I could swear I saw figures moving around the well, tall, shadowy shapes that seemed to be watching us with hungry eyes. Elena's chanting grew more urgent, and suddenly the air above the well began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Through the shimmer, I caught glimpses of something else, a landscape that wasn't quite there, full of soft light and swaying grass. "The doorway," Elena whispered. "It's working." One by one, the shadowy figures began moving toward the shimmer. They walked slowly, hesitantly, as if they weren't quite sure what they were seeing. But as the first one stepped through and disappeared into that other landscape, the rest began to follow more eagerly. I lost count of how many spirits passed through the doorway. Dozens, certainly, maybe hundreds. Men, women, children, all of them walking with the jerky, uncertain gait of people who had been sitting still for far too long. Finally the flow stopped. Elena completed her chant, and the shimmer faded, leaving us standing in the cold darkness around an abandoned well. "One down," she said, blowing out the candles. "Two to go." The barn was next. It was a long, low structure that looked like it might fall down if someone sneezed too hard. The doors were hanging off their hinges, and years of wind and weather had stripped most of the paint from the siding. Elena set up her ritual in the center of the barn, where decades of hay and manure had left the dirt floor rich and dark. This time, the response was immediate. Before she'd even finished lighting the candles, we could hear movement in the shadows, rustling sounds like dry leaves or old paper. "They're eager," Elena murmured. "That's good. The ones at the well must have told them what was happening." The second doorway opened more easily than the first, and the spirits moved through it with obvious relief. These seemed to be more recent deaths. I recognized a few faces from the photographs in Margaret's files. Tom Carmichael was among them, looking confused but determined as he stepped through the shimmer and disappeared into the light. "Two down," Elena said as the doorway closed. Now for the hard part. The basement was exactly as I'd left it. Concrete walls, exposed beams, and the bricked-up coal chute in the far corner. But the moment we descended the stairs, I could feel the difference. The air was thick and oppressive, like being underwater, and every breath took effort. Elena set up her materials at the base of the stairs, but her hands were shaking as she lit the candles. "This is where it lives," she said quietly. "The warden, I can feel it watching us." Rex refused to come down the stairs. He sat at the top, whining and pawing at the ground, every muscle in his body tense with fear. "Maybe we should listen to the dog," I said. "Too late now. If we leave without completing the ritual, it'll just get stronger and angrier." Elena began her chant, but this time something fought back. The candles flickered wildly, and several went out despite the lack of any breeze. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted so fast that ice began forming on the walls. "Keep focusing on the doorway," Elena said through chattering teeth. "Don't let it distract you." But distraction was exactly what it had in mind. The basement filled with voices, dozens of them, all talking at once in a cacophony of pleas, threats, and accusations. I heard my own voice among them, begging for help, screaming in terror, laughing with insane glee. Then I heard Elena scream. I spun around to find her backing away from the coal chute, her face white with terror. The bricks were crumbling, falling away from the wall as if something massive was pushing against them from the other side. "It's coming through," she gasped. "The warden, it doesn't want to lose its prisoners." The wall exploded outward in a shower of brick and mortar. What came through wasn't quite a physical thing. It was more like a hole in reality, a space where light went to die, but it had presence, weight, malevolent intelligence that pressed against my mind like a crushing weight. Elena grabbed the wooden box containing the spirit anchor. "Change of plans. We're going to bind it." I thought the anchor was for the spirits. "It is. But if we can bind the warden first, the spirits should be able to escape on their own." She pressed the box into my hands. "You have to get close to it. Close enough to touch." I looked at the thing that had emerged from the coal chute, a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to have too many angles, too many teeth, too many eyes. Getting close to it seemed like the definition of suicide. What happens to me? I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. The thing was moving toward us now, flowing across the basement floor like spilled oil. Where it passed, the concrete cracked and the air itself seemed to wither. I opened the box and pulled out the spirit anchor. It was warm to the touch, pulsing with its own inner light that pushed back the darkness around it. "Now," Elena shouted. I ran toward the thing, the anchor held out in front of me like a weapon. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, until I felt like I was trying to run through molasses. The thing reared up in front of me, towering to the ceiling, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been its true form, something ancient and hungry and utterly alien. Then I pressed the anchor against it. The world exploded in light and sound and sensation that my human senses couldn't process. I felt myself falling, not through space but through time, through layers of reality that folded and twisted around me like origami made of broken glass. When I hit bottom, I was lying on the basement floor, and the thing was gone. In its place was a small pile of what looked like charcoal, still warm to the touch. Elena helped me sit up. "How do you feel?" I took inventory. Everything seemed to work. Arms, legs, head, internal organs. But there was something different, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "The spirits," I said. "Are they free?" Elena looked around the basement. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by something that felt lighter, cleaner. "I think so. I can't sense any of them anymore." We climbed the stairs to find Rex waiting for us, tail wagging for the first time since we'd arrived at the house. Outside, dawn was breaking over the valley, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "So it's over?" I asked. Elena nodded. "The warden is bound. The spirits are free. It should be safe now." But even as she said it, I felt the truth settling into my bones like a cold weight. The spirit anchor wasn't just in my pocket, it was part of me now, connected to my life force in ways I was only beginning to understand. I could feel the warden's presence like a constant whisper at the edge of my consciousness, not gone but contained, held in check by my will and my life. "There's something you're not telling me," I said. Elena avoided my eyes. "The binding worked better than we hoped. But bindings like this, they require a constant energy source to maintain them. Meaning you can't leave. Not permanently. The anchor is tied to this place now, and to you. If you go too far away for too long, the binding weakens." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "How far is too far?" "I don't know. Maybe a few miles. Maybe a few hundred yards. We'll have to test it carefully." So there it was. I'd succeeded in freeing the trapped spirits and neutralizing the threat, but the cost was my freedom. I was now the guardian of something that could never be allowed to escape, tied to this isolated valley for the rest of my life. Will other people be safe in the house now? Should be. The warden was what made it dangerous. Without that feeding on the spiritual energy, the house should be just a house. Over the next few weeks we tested the limits of my new condition. I could drive to town without any problems, could even make it as far as the county seat before I started feeling dizzy and disoriented. But when I tried to go farther, something inside me began to unravel. The anchor grew cold against my skin, and I could feel the warden stirring in its prison, testing the boundaries of its cage. I settled into a new routine. I worked remotely from my consulting clients, took long walks around the property with Rex, and slowly began to appreciate the simple rhythms of rural life. The house felt different now, lighter, more welcoming. I had the basement properly sealed and renovated the upstairs into a comfortable living space. Margaret visited often, bringing casseroles and gossip from town. Elena stayed for a month, helping me understand my new role and teaching me rituals to strengthen the binding. When she finally left to return to her life in Portland, I felt the loneliness of my situation settle around me like a familiar coat. But it wasn't a bad life. The isolation that had once felt oppressive now felt protective. I read voraciously, wrote more than I ever had in Chicago, and found a peace I hadn't known I was looking for. Rex grew fat and happy, and the house gradually became the kind of place where a person could live contentedly for decades. Sometimes, late at night, I could feel the warden pressing against the walls of its prison. It was patient, ancient, willing to wait decades or centuries for its chance at freedom. But the binding held strong, fed by my life force and my determination to keep it contained. I thought about the spirits we'd freed, wondering where they'd gone, hoping they'd found the peace that had been denied them for so long. Sometimes I imagined I could see them in the early morning mist that rose from the valley, walking towards some distant horizon I couldn't perceive. Margaret died in her sleep 2 winters later, passing quietly and without pain at the age of 75. I found her the next morning when she didn't answer her phone, Rex having led me to her house with unusual urgency. She looked peaceful, as if she'd simply decided it was time to go. Elena came back for the funeral, staying long enough to make sure I was handling my responsibilities properly. "How are you holding up?" she asked the night before she left again. "Some days are harder than others, but I understand why this had to be done. Do you regret it?" I thought about Tom Carmichael, about all the families who'd been driven from their homes by forces they couldn't understand or control. I thought about the children who'd died in that house, the people who'd taken their own lives rather than face another night of supernatural terror. No, I said finally, I don't regret it. Years passed. I grew older, grayer, more comfortable with my strange fate. The town slowly accepted me as a permanent resident, one of those eccentric characters that small communities seem to collect. Sheriff Morrison retired and was replaced by his deputy, a young woman named Sarah, who occasionally stopped by to check on the hermit living in the old Carmichael place. I wrote 3 novels during those years, published by a small press that didn't ask too many questions about why their author never did book tours or public appearances. The stories came easily now, as if my proximity to the supernatural had opened channels in my imagination I'd never known existed. Rex died at the age of 14, peacefully in his sleep beside my bed. I buried him in the pasture behind the house, under an oak tree where he'd like to nap in the summer shade. For weeks afterward, I could swear I heard him barking at phantom intruders, still protecting me even in death. Elena visited every few years, checking on the binding and bringing news from the outside world. She'd married a professor from Portland State and had 2 children who showed signs of inheriting the family's psychic sensitivity. They ask about their strange uncle who lives in the haunted house, she told me during one visit. What do you tell them? That some people are called to guard things that others can't or won't guard. That it's a lonely job but an important one. On my 60th birthday, I climbed to the top of the hill behind my house and looked out over the valley I'd called home for more than 20 years. The view was spectacular, rolling farmlands stretching to the horizon, dotted with barns and silos and houses where normal people lived normal lives. I could feel the anchor against my chest, warm and steady, a reminder of the responsibility I carried. Somewhere deep in whatever dimension served as its prison, the warden waited with inhuman patience for its chance at freedom. That the binding held strong would hold strong as long as I lived to maintain it. And what would happen when I died? That was a question I tried not to think about too often. Elena had theories. Maybe the anchor would seek out a new guardian. Maybe the binding would become self-sustaining. Maybe the warden would simply fade away after so many years of imprisonment. But theories weren't certainties, and I'd learned to live with uncertainty. What mattered was that for now, today, the valley was safe. Children could play in these fields without fear. Families could build homes and live normal lives. Travelers could pass through without being touched by ancient hungers. The price of that safety was my freedom, but it was a price I'd chosen to pay with my eyes wide open. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of completion. Not the kind that comes from finishing a project or achieving a goal, but the deeper satisfaction of knowing you found your purpose in life, even if it wasn't the purpose you'd originally imagined. I walked back down the hill to my house, where lamplight glowed warmly in the windows and a fire crackled in the fireplace. It was a good house now, a peaceful house, the kind of place where a man could live quietly and die content. But as I reached for the front door handle, I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from inside the house. For a moment the old fear crashed over me like a wave. Then I remembered I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the guardian. And if something new had found its way into my house, I was the one with the power to deal with it. I opened the door and stepped inside, ready to face whatever waited for me in the darkness. After all, I'd been preparing for this moment for 20 years. The footsteps stopped. The house held its breath, and in that silence, I finally understood what the spirits had been trying to tell me all along. The warden wasn't the only thing that had been trapped in this place. Every person who died here, every soul that had been claimed by the house's hunger, had left something behind, not malevolent, not dangerous, just present. They weren't haunting the house anymore, they were protecting it, protecting me. I smiled in the darkness, no longer afraid. I wasn't alone here. Would never be alone. The house was full of invisible guardians, former victims who'd become allies in keeping the real darkness at bay. Thank you, I whispered to the empty rooms, and I could swear I heard voices whispering back. Not words exactly, but something that felt like acceptance, like welcome, like home. I've been living here for 25 years now, and I plan to live here for 25 more if my health holds out. The valley is peaceful, the house is safe, and the warden remains securely bound in its prison of spirit and will. Sometimes people ask me if I ever regret my choice, if I ever wish I could leave this place and see the world beyond these hills. The answer is complicated. Of course, I wonder what my life might have been like if I'd never bought this house, never encountered the supernatural forces that changed everything. But regret? No. I think about the children who now play safely in this valley, the families who live without fear, the travelers who pass through without being touched by ancient hungers. I think about Tom Carmichael and all the others who died here, finally at peace in whatever realm awaits the departed. And I think about purpose. Most people spend their entire lives searching for meaning, for something that makes their existence matter. I found mine in the basement of a haunted house, and it's been with me ever since. The anchor pulses against my chest as I write these words, a steady rhythm that matches my heartbeat. Somewhere in its prison, the warden waits with infinite patience for its chance at freedom. But that chance will never come, not as long as I draw breath. I am the guardian of this place, the keeper of ancient darkness, the protector of innocent lives. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I chose. And on quiet nights like this one, when the wind whispers through the valley and the stars shine bright overhead, I can honestly say it's enough. More than enough. It's home.